Um, just to give you a background, I'm a Jewish Zionist, and at the same time, I don't feel that the issue needs to be as polarized as you experience it, people like Dershowitz and perhaps yourself, in that a lot of what you say I very much agree with. And if we're looking at where I think there is an area of cognitive dissonance for me, and my question really is it an area for you as well, has to do with, not with the two-state solution, because most Jews in the United States and Israel are for that, or even the boundaries. It has to do with the right of return for Palestinians. And obviously the cognitive dissonance is that there is grave injustice that I can see, and a lot of people can see, in expelling the Palestinians. At the same time, we imagine what it would be like were Israel to open the gates and have a tremendous influx of non-Jews. It would eventually become a non-Jewish state. There's my cognitive dissonance, and I would ask of you, because you were presenting it as this is all very simple situation, but I wondered if you had cognitive dissonance on any of this as well.
Well, first of all, people in the audience may disagree with me, and I'm not out to win a popularity contest. I want to settle the conflict. And settling the conflict means trying to honestly deal with these questions. I think that's a reasonable question. I'm not sure if I would use a fancy term like cognitive dissonance. I tried to steer away from this terminology which tries to make this conflict sound more complicated than it is. It is a difficult question. One has to make a distinction, however, in my opinion, between what is your legal right and then how do you resolve the question practically. What does that mean for our purposes? If you allow me a small illustration, I'm not comparing, please bear in mind, I'm not comparing magnitudes of suffering. I'm trying to simply illustrate a point. Magnitudes of suffering, there's no comparison, obviously. As you know, I was denied tenure at DePaul. DePaul's case was not very strong. In fact, DePaul's case was preposterous. And my lawyer said, I had a wonderful lawyer who's a close friend of mine, Lynn Bernabe, and she said, Norman, if you go to court, you can win the case, and you'll win your right of return to DePaul. She said, that's an open and shut case. DePaul acknowledged you were an excellent teacher and scholar. How can they deny you tenure? But she said, Norm, do you really want to spend the next 6 years in court? Because that's how long tenure cases usually take. By the time I got tenure, I'd be already too late. I'm not a spring chicken anymore. And it would also mean consuming valuable time for me. And I'd rather work on my political commitments than on this academic freedom issue, because I never believed in academic freedom. I just think it's nonsense. It's a myth. So she said, okay, if you don't want to go to court, and she said, I agree with you, then we have to aim for a settlement. And we got a settlement. And the settlement had to have two components. Number one, our settlement had to have a public recognition by DePaul that had committed an injustice against me. It dragged me through the mud the last year, maligned my name, slandered me, character assassinated me. They had to acknowledge, no, Professor Finkelstein was an outstanding professor at this school. And they did. The statement said, we acknowledge Professor Finkelstein was an outstanding teacher and a prolific scholar. And then the second component was a financial component to the settlement. Now, I never gave up my right to return. I still think I had the right. But all things considered, I was willing to reach a settlement. which I thought under the circumstances was reasonable. And I say the same principle with the Palestinians. They have the right. It is incontestable. I can tell you from personal knowledge. As I said earlier, Human Rights Watch is a conservative organization. And when the issue of the right of return came up, a member of the board of directors for the first time hired a private lawyer to try to prove the Palestinians didn't have a right of return. And it created a huge schism in the organization. But at the end of the day, they researched a dozen other examples of refugee generation in the war, and they said there can't be any question. The Palestinians have the right to return. So we can't contest that right. Acknowledge the right, and then if you think that it's unfeasible, you believe, then you have to make the Palestinians an offer which they're willing to accept. Nobody has the right to tell the Palestinians they have no right. If you think that Israel can't meet that demand, then you have to make an offer to them, a settlement offer, which, just like myself, they're willing to accept. But what I will not accept is anybody telling the Palestinians, as a precondition for negotiations, that they have to give up the right. That's their right. At one of the schools where I taught at Brooklyn College when I was fired in 1992, some students were upset and they went to one of the radical professors on campus and said, you know, don't you think you should fight for Norman's right to stay? And he said, well, I think Finkelstein would be happier elsewhere. And I thought to myself, hey, I thought I was supposed to be the one to decide that. We have no right to tell other people what to do with their rights. Our responsibility is to support their rights. And then if somebody thinks, the other side thinks it can't work, okay, make them an offer. And I can't say I'm fully cognizant of the Arab or the Palestinian mind, whatever that means. But my experience has been Palestinians are perfectly reasonable. Make a reasonable offer, and let's see what happens. But let's just be clear. The Israeli position now is a non-starter. The official Israeli position is, to quote Ehud Barak in Camp David, we will not accept any moral, legal, or historical responsibility for what happened to the Palestinians. That's like DePaul refusing to acknowledge what happened to me. No, that's a non-starter. I can tell you from personal experience, I'm not allowed to discuss the terms of my settlement. But had DePaul not issued that statement, we're going to court. Yes, I want my dignity restored. I want my humanity restored. And the Palestinians have that right as well. You can't tell them they had no historical right to be in the country where they were born and where all of their ancestors were born. And now you're going to come along and say they had no right to be there? No, you're not. Be reasonable. Be reasonable. Be respectful of other people's feelings and sufferings. My closest friend in the occupied territories and one of my closest friends for life, Musa Abu Heshesh. He's the Hebron field representative for B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. And he grew up in Fawar camp. And he said to me, you know, Norm, I'm conservative on the refugee question. And he took me to the room where his family grew up. The room is about, a little bigger than this podium. And no, He's not going to accept that you're simply going to abolish the whole history and pretend it didn't happen. Well, that's a non-starter. Be reasonable. Respect other people's dignity. Respect their suffering. And I'm fully confident that you can achieve a settlement with the Palestinians, but not on the terms that Israel is now presenting. Namely, we don't even begin negotiations until the Palestinians give up their rights. No, they don't. Nobody has to give up their rights. And nobody has the right to tell them to give up their rights. Our responsibility is to defend their rights and then see what happens.